things that will probably take some time. So I'm calling the meeting to order at 10:01 a.m. Beth, can you call the roll?
Yes. I'll go by library name. If you could just state your first and last name, please. Algonquin.
Sarah Murray.
Carrie.
Diane McNulty.
Crystal Lake.
Erin McGaldy.
Des Plaines.
Joe Bonell.
Ela.
Lauren Rosenthal.
Evanston.
Karen Danzig Lyons.
Fox River Valley. Back for that. Fremont.
Scott Davis.
Glencoe.
Andy Kim.
Glenview.
Terry Room.
Grace Lake.
Sarah Brown.
Highland Park.
Heidi Smith.
Huntley.
Frank Novak.
Indian Trails.
Ryan Uden.
Lake Forest.
Catherine Lemmer.
Lake Villa.
Nick Jacobson.
Lincolnwood.
Josephine Tucci.
McHenry.
Leslie Jakacki.
Morden Grove.
Pam Leffler.
Niles, Maine.
Cindy Rademacher.
Northbrook.
Kate Hall.
Palatine.
Melissa Gardner.
Park Ridge.
Joanna Bertucci.
Prospect Heights.
Alex Dodd.
Round Lake. Wilmette.
Anthony Austin.
Winnetka. And Zion Benton.
Robin Smith.
I'll circle back up. Fox River Valley. Keep an eye out. Round Lake. And Winnetka. Present for CCS, we have Deborah Wishmeyer and Beth Stonebringer.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jim over at Round Lake. I apologize. I am here.
Hi, Jim. Thank you.
I texted Roxanne to hopefully she'll be here from Fox River Valley.
Thank you, Lauren.
Okay, are there any additions to the agenda? The next item on our agenda is the consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda? Or does anyone want to pull anything off from the consent agenda?
Kate Hall Northbrook. So moved.
Karen Danzig Lyons, Evanston, second.
Thank you. Beth, can you call the roll?
Algonquin.
Yes.
Carrie.
Yes.
Crystal Lake.
Yes.
Des Plaines.
Yes.
Ela.
Yes.
Evanston.
Yes.
Fox River Valley. Fremont.
Yes.
Glencoe.
Yes.
Glenview.
Yes.
Grace Lake.
Yes.
Highland Park.
Yes.
Huntley.
Yes.
Indian Trails.
Yes.
Lake Forest.
Yes.
Lake Villa.
Yes.
Lincolnwood.
Yes.
McHenry.
Yes.
Morden Grove.
Yes.
Niles, Maine.
Yes.
Northbrook.
Yes.
Palatine.
Yes.
Thank you. Park Ridge.
Yes.
Prospect Heights.
Oh, yeah.
Round Lake.
Yes.
Wilmette.
Yes.
Winnetka. And Zion.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. So we have Ms. Lindsay Ryan coming today to speak to us about EDI issues, specifically related to adding another field to the library card application process and LEAP. So she is slated to join us around 10:25 and get started with her presentation at about 10:30. So hopefully we'll be able to get through the next couple of agenda items within the next 20 minutes or so. So the first agenda item under new business is a recommendation from Budget and Finance Committee regarding Rails LSEP support allocation. And Mick, do you want to present this to the group, please?
Sure, happy to do so. Thank you. We talked a little bit about this last governing board, if anybody actually remembers that, a million years ago. The Budget and Finance Committee, Rails has kind of rethought how they allocate these funds through the LSAP grant, and they've taken a lens of equity. And when I say equity, about like budget and finance and things of that nature. And so we in turn wanted to honor that kind of the Rails sort of approach to this, and to and when I say we, the Budget and Finance Committee, to then pass it through to our members in such a way. So this would generally, in the past, we have, I believe we split this evenly between all libraries, and this time we are splitting it more with an equity lens, kind of how Rails distributed to us. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to just go through it, or anybody else in the committee if I missed anything on this. There's a lot of math. I don't have that in front of me, but like, I think that the highest, it's a generally $3,000 or $4,000 difference from the person who, the library that would get the lowest amount and the library that would get the largest amount. So if you have a question, please let me know. And if not, I'd be happy to make the motion.
Yeah, and I can jump in with just a couple additional details. The new grant formula is looking at 4 different metrics, and those were outlined in the documentation sent ahead of time. So 3 of those apply to CCS. That's collection expenditures per capita, the annual LSAP fee as a percentage of the library's operating expenditures, and then ILL and reciprocal borrowing transactions. The 4th metric is a multi-type bonus, but since CCS only has public libraries, we do not receive any funding for that 4th metric. So of these 3 metrics that apply to us, 2 of them are library specific. That's collection expenditures, and then the LSAP fee as a percentage of the library's operating expenditures. So per the new grant formula, each CCS library is assigned a specific dollar amount that we receive as part of the grant. So the recommendation from Budget and Finance is to essentially split those by library according to the amount that is received by Rails. And then for the 3rd metric, ILL reciprocal transaction, that is CCS system-wide ILL and reciprocal borrowing transactions. The recommendation is to just split that evenly amongst all libraries. So again, we're distributing the ILL funding received per the grant evenly amongst all libraries. That's 60% of the funds we receive via the LSAP grant. And then the 40% that goes to collection expenditures and LSAP fee to split that according to the amount assigned by Rails. So hopefully that clarified and didn't confuse further.
Anyone have any questions for either Mick or Deborah regarding this? No? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Mick.
Yeah, you don't even have to ask me. Recommend to the governing board to approve the LSAP support allocation for fiscal year 21-22 and split the collection expenditures per capita and the annual fee to budget by amount assigned by Rails, and split the ILL/reciprocal borrowing funding evenly amongst all CCS libraries.
Second, Lauren Rosenthal.
Great, thank you. Beth, can you call the roll, please?
I'll start with Lake Villa,
Yes.
Lincolnwood,
Yes.
McHenry,
Yes.
Morton Grove,
Yes.
Niles, Maine,
Yes.
Northbrook,
Yes.
Palatine,
Yes.
Park Ridge,
Yes.
Prospect Heights,
Heck yeah.
Round Lake,
Yes.
Wilmette,
Yes.
Winnetka, Zion,
Yes.
Algonquin,
Yes.
Cary,
Yes.
Crystal Lake,
Yes.
Des Plaines,
Yes.
Gila,
Yes.
Evanston,
Yes.
Fox River Valley, Fremont,
Yes.
Glencoe,
Yes.
Glenview,
Yes.
Grays Lake,
Yes.
Island Park,
Yes.
Huntley,
Yes.
Indian Trails,
Yes.
and Lake Forest.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, everyone. The next order of business is the recommendation from Bylaws and Policy Committee regarding CCS bylaws. While she is no longer the chair of the Bylaws Committee, she was when this happened. So Heidi is going to go over these changes with the group. So Heidi.
Thank you so much. On page 13 of the packet, there's a link to a marked up copy of the bylaws. And just to talk through those, the high points are summarized in the attached minutes, but we'll just talk through them in the order of the document and hit the highlights. So overall, the language throughout the document was made gender neutral. On page 4 of the bylaws, an outdated reference dated 2007 in Article 2, Section 2 was removed. And stop me at any time if you have any questions or comments about these individual items. On page 16 of the bylaws, the group determined that the budget really should be approved by 2/3 of the membership versus 2/3 of those present at the governing board meeting in which the budget would be approved. So that recommendation is included. Oh, I skipped one. Sorry, on page 13. Article 3, Section 6 expands the policy for removal of an officer. We had a lot of discussion about this, but it was the recommendation of our attorney that this be broad and that there be a 2/3 voting requirement to remove an officer without cause. And just to emphasize, this is not removing a board member, this is relieving someone of their duties as an officer. And, you know, we really went through everything with this and really felt like this was the way to go based on our attorney's recommendation. On page 27, our attorney recommended a new Article 13 on liability, specifically officers and members. We reviewed it and didn't make any changes to his recommendations. And lastly, in the future, CCS may need to revisit the quorum and attendance section if changes are made to OMA, or CCS determines committee meetings would be hosted virtually. So any changes have been tabled until a future date, more information is available. So that is my report. Happy to answer any questions you might have. All right, hearing none, I would make a motion to recommend to the governing board to approve the CCS bylaws as revised.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second. Joanna from Park Ridge.
Comes from committee, so it doesn't need a second.
Right, I always forget. Thank you, Scott. Beth, can you call the roll, please?
Start with Highland Park,
Yes.
Huntley,
Yes.
Indian Trails,
Yes.
Lake Forest,
Yes.
Lake Villa,
Yes.
Lincolnwood,
Yes.
McHenry,
Yes.
Morton Grove,
Yes.
Niles, Maine,
Yes.
Northbrook,
Yes.
Palatine,
Yes.
Park Ridge,
Yes.
Prospect Heights.
Yep.
Round Lake,
Yes.
Wilmette,
Yes.
Winnetka, Zion Benton,
Yes.
Algonquin,
Yes.
Cary,
Yes.
Crystal Lake,
Yes.
Des Plaines,
Yes.
Ela, sorry, Ela,
Lauren, you're muted.
Sorry, yes.
thank you, Evanston,
Yes.
Fox River Valley, Fremont,
Yes.
Glencoe, Glencoe,
Andy, you're muted.
Yes.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, sorry, Glenview
Yes.
and Grayslake.
Yes.
Thank you.
So we're done with the 2 orders of business that we need to take care of before Biz is here, but we have 10 minutes to fill now. So I don't know how we want to approach this, Deborah. I know you and I talked about the timing of today's meeting, so.
I'm happy to, if it's allowed, to flip over to the the agenda item following business presentation if we're allowed to go out of order. So I'll give my update on the Innovative Development Partner Program, which was promised to all of you at this meeting. In your packets, I shared an updated timeline for the Innovative Vega Development Partner Program. Since we last met, CCS has recruited 6 of our member libraries to be our beta partners for the program. They are Algonquin, Cary, Des Plaines, Fox River Valley, Lake Villa, and Niles, Maine. So we're very, very excited to start working with all of those libraries later in the month, early August. Our beta partners will participate in the soft launch of Vega Discover later this summer, early fall, by adopting Vega Discover at their in-house OPACs. So they'll begin helping their patrons use Vega Discover, and they'll also assist us in gathering feedback from their patrons and participate in user testing with us so that we can use that feedback to help determine whether or not Vega Discover will be a good fit for CCS and our communities. So we've received a training version of Vega. So it is set up syncing against our training environment that we will hopefully be able to share out with everyone in this Friday's CCS news. So CCS received admin training on the back end of Vega Discover. So I think we have a couple more configuration pieces to set, but then we'll be sharing the new platform out with all of our libraries so that they can begin testing it, letting us know what they like, what they don't like, where staff may potentially see some concerns. We'll receive a second instance of Vega that syncs against our production environment later this summer. They're anticipating right now that will be in August. The timeline set can fluctuate a little bit depending on the development progress. So once we have that instance that's syncing against production, we'll be able to work with our beta libraries to implement Discover within their physical buildings, and then we'll begin to do our user testing with the production interface. Again, while they'll be setting up a Vega instance that syncs against production, PowerPack, our normal catalog, will be up and running simultaneously. We'll continue to use PowerPack while we're in this beta testing phase. Does anyone have any questions about the program?
I don't have any questions. And I know that this is like the exact same language we've used in like a ton of stuff, Deborah. I'm just wondering if we can update the language in the March 2022. It presupposes that that the vote in January is obviously going to say yes. And so I know we had some discussion at the last meeting. I can't remember who, there were a couple of people that had expressed some concern, and I just want to make sure that we're not going forward on the 100% assumption that we're moving forward. I think that if it's good, and we absolutely should, and that's why we're doing this, so that we can weigh in and craft something for us, but that it isn't a foregone conclusion that we're going to move forward, that it would be March 2022 that we go live if the vote in January is yes.
That's good
that make sense?
clarification. Yes, the March 2022 rollout would only be if governing board votes in January to adopt Vega as our primary discovery interface. So we will not roll out on Vega if we don't vote to move to Vega.
Yeah.
So that's good clarification for future documentation. We're planning to do user testing virtually with about 10 patrons. So 10 to 12 patrons, 2 from each of our libraries. So hopefully we're planning to schedule that user testing prior to October governing board so that we can present sort of a preliminary analysis of how patrons like the new discovery interface. Are they able to accomplish the tasks they need to within the new platform? So we'll hopefully have some information on how that user testing goes for the group to share in October.
I know this wasn't part of it. We did a lot of that during the ILS migration for some of the customizations. It would be fascinating if some of the libraries had also done that, to do a comparison at some point, probably not for November, but that shows like, oh, hey, this was how it performed in this environment versus the Vega environment. I don't know if we have, I can't recall anything before, you know, in the before times really, but if that's something that even a couple libraries that we could show like how it weighed out.
We do have some data from the user testing we conducted in, gosh, it was now, I think 2019, that we did
Right,
that
the
user
before
testing.
times.
The before times, yes. So we do have some baseline data on like patron success rates with performing various activities in the pack. So we should be able to compare the two interfaces and the scores that were tabulated based on that previous user testing with the new user testing. But that is a good idea. If we're not really able to compare apples to apples, we may want to consider doing some basic Power Pack testing.
Oh yeah, we could, I guess, because we still have it. So we could still test people on the usability. Duh. Yeah, it's a really good point.
So that October meeting, again, we'll hopefully be able at that point to provide a summary of the feedback we've gathered so far from patrons and then from staff as well. Though I will say this focus from staff testing will be more helping us identify potential issues, bugs, software malfunctions, and then the patron user testing will focus on, again, usability. Are the patrons able to accomplish the tasks they need to? So we should have that update for the group in October, which will leave us a few months wiggle room in case we need to conduct some additional user testing based on feedback from this team here.
Thank
Any
you.
other questions?
Yeah, does anyone else have any questions for Deborah regarding this? No. Okay. We have a few more minutes. I don't know how quickly we can get through the next item on the agenda, the COVID-19 updates.
And give them a start and then see where we end up.
Okay.
So as you're likely aware, the governor's emergency modifications to OMA to allow for virtual meetings, they will expire this month. So executive committee has decided they'll move back to in-person meetings in August and September. And Lake Villa has kindly agreed to host us for October governing board in person, and Palatine has offered to host us in January. So at this time, outside of governance groups, technical groups and advisory groups will remain virtual through the end of the calendar year. So we're planning that technical and advisory group meetings for your staff will continue to be virtual through December. We have heard some feedback from directors that your staff like virtual meetings. They don't have to commute too far. It's convenient. They're productive meetings. So CCS is going to gather some data from our members to determine in the fall whether or not we want to continue with virtual meetings for technical and advisory groups, or if we want to move back to in-person beginning in 2022. So we want to make sure we're getting some feedback from all of your staff on what their preference would be. Technical and advisory groups are not governance committees, so they can continue to meet virtual regardless of any future modifications to OMA.
And didn't we have a hybrid option too that we had mentioned for some of those groups as well, of maybe like a combo of both? That might have been another group I'm in though, because there's a lot of this discussion happening.
There sure is. We talked about whether, potentially we'd want to have like winter technical and advisory group meetings virtually because weather stinks sometimes in Chicago in February and January, and then host the like summertime meetings in person, or potentially have advisory groups virtual and technical groups in person. So we'll need to, again, get some feedback from your staff to see what they prefer. And we're going to do some analyzing of our meeting minutes from pre-COVID times to during COVID times to see what attendance looks like, meeting lengths and attendance to see if did we get better turnout virtually, or was it comparable, or do we get more people in person? So we're going to take a look at some of that data too. Governance committees, so budget and finance, bylaws and policy. There was a question of whether those will need to move back to in-person or if those can remain virtual. That's something we'll discuss as part of sort of this fall look at our meeting locations. We have no additional governance subcommittees aside from executive committee and governing board scheduled through the fall.
Okay. I know my staff really likes the virtual meetings, so. Great. It's 10:25 now, so I am reluctant to get into any other agenda items since I think Biz is going to be hopping on soon. Deborah, correct? She said that she was going to hop on about 10:25. So
Yeah, so I can go ahead as we wait for Biz to sign on. I don't see her here in the list, but we'll keep looking for her. I'll give a brief introduction to why we're having a presenter here at this group today. So as many of you know, in May, Database Management approved a request from the Evanston Public Library to add a new demographic field to Polaris for race and ethnicity. Evanston will be using the data gathered over time to ensure that they're equitably serving all patrons in their community. During our discussions around implementation, both at database management and at executive committee in May, it was clear we had a lot of questions about this, questions about the best way to configure and implement the field, questions about why a library would need to collect this kind of data, how it would impact patron trust in the library, and how we could ensure that staff aren't misusing this data in their day-to-day jobs. So to make sure we're actively addressing those questions of our members, we hired a consultant to work with us on implementation and also to present to this group today so that all of you have an opportunity to ask questions and discuss this together. So is Biz on yet?
No, I don't see her.
and I just want to emphasize too that we're not asking anyone to make a decision about whether or not you're going to use this today. We're simply here to learn more about this and why we may or may not want to include, or why we may want to include this data as we register people for cards. But we don't expect any of you to make a decision about this after at today's meeting. So I just wanted to clarify that.
And we are, well, we had previously shared that this field would be available. We had planned to implement it July 1 prior to this meeting, but Evanston, Biz and I have had many discussions over the past month about how we want to configure the drop-down menu, and we will need to be taking some configuration options back to database management at their August 3rd meeting. So at this time, we do not expect the field to be implemented until mid-August. And I would like to clarify again, at this time, Evanston is the only library who has expressed interest in using this field. And for everyone else, while you'll see the field, the ability to pick options from a list will be disabled for your staff. So again, this field will be available if in the future your library would be interested in gathering this type of demographic data, if it would help your own DEI initiatives at your library. But until your library decides that you would want to opt into this, this field will not be able to be completed for your patrons. So I did want to clarify that right off the bat.
So we'll still, just to clarify a little bit further, Deborah, we'll see the field, but we won't have the ability to choose anything in there. It will just be NA, correct?
That's correct. So the label of the field will be there for staff. So if they click into the registration view of a patron's account, they'll see the race ethnicity field labeled. However, no values will be able to be chosen from the list. We need just one placeholder value for the field, and that would be non-applicable. So if staff felt the need to pick something from the drop-down menu, all they could pick was not applicable. The field will display for Evanston cardholders to staff of other libraries, but staff at other libraries should not be modifying that field for Evanston patrons. And Karen is here. Karen, from Evans, did you have anything to add about implementation of this field on your end as we're waiting?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. We will do extensive training. We'll have frequently asked questions. This is an option for our patrons to opt in. And whether they opt in or not, of course, we will provide them with a new library card or renew their library card. Some of this discussion has occurred over many months with our Racial Equity Task Force. One of the questions that they asked, I think correctly, is how do we know we're moving the needle? We're focusing our work, we're shifting our resources, looking through a racial equity lens, but how do we know that the patrons we're serving, the patrons we're adding, get at this core value of racial equity? And I would never, nor do I think any of you would ever want staff to look at someone and guess. I mean, that's nothing that we would ever do. I want the patrons to know that we want to serve them, that we see them, and that we want to partner with them in engaging in learning more about them, so we can refine programs, we can do target marketing, we can look at how we allocate resources and time, whether it's programs or collections, and just really begin to know more about our patrons. You know, I expect in the new census numbers that we'll see, for example, in Evanston, that we're losing Black residents due to gentrification. And we know that we're welcoming new immigrants in all the time, especially Spanish-speaking immigrants from all around the world. So we just want to partner with our patrons, see them, know who they are, and serve them more effectively, and watch to see what difference our work is making, and hopefully be able to track and show an improvement through our racial equity lens.
And I will note, I sent Biz the wrong link. So I apologize in advance. The delay is totally on me. I sent her an old link for governing board. So I just sent her the new one. So we should expect her to pop in any second now. So I do apologize for that delay. It is on me.
So Karen, so patrons will be asked to self-identify, like when they're filling out a library card application. Is that how that's going to work? And then if they want to note their racial makeup in their card, to let, like, I already have a card, how do I let you know? Just like tell staff people? Just curious.
Well, we'll do some messaging around this new initiative that we will hopefully be launching sooner rather than later, but it's completely voluntary. And so we would only, you know, if someone came up and said, oh, I see that you got a new initiative, let me tell you about myself, then of course we'll put that in, but we will only ask if they would like to voluntarily self-identify when they're registering for a new card or renewing. And so we know it'll take a while to really begin to have some data that we can share with all of you, and also then reflect on how our work is going, and continue to reallocate resources.
Thank you. I see that Biz is here. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I interrupt?
Sorry, I just have a quick question. One of my staff members asked if there would ever be an option for people to self-report in the PAC.
That is something we'll need to look at the configuration for, if there is an editable field. And again, if we do choose to move forward with that, that's something we can ask the development team as well to see what our options would be. And as Pam noted, we see that Biz is signed on, so I'm happy to introduce Elizabeth Biz Lindsay Ryan, who is an equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant, trainer, and professor. So Biz has worked with many educational institutions, nonprofits, and companies to help build capacity for EDI within their cultures through curriculum development, facilitation of discussions, evaluations of policies, strategic planning, and more. So Biz, we're happy to turn it over to you. And I'm sorry about the login snafu.
No problem. I was like, I have been here for a while and I'm not getting let in. So let me just check in. You know, this is our new life where we are stuck with passwords and Zoom access and the rest of it. So in this business, we are flexible, if nothing else. It's great to see you all today. I'm excited to be with you. You know, I think as we talk about this functionality in the database, I wanted to really give everybody a baseline for some of the concepts in EDI that influence why we think this matters, right? So this conversation today is going to be kind of thinking about the what, how, and why. Like, we're still figuring out all of the logistics of the access fields and things, and we're working towards a solution, but we're really today wanting to explore kind of why does this data matter, and a big part of that is that we are in a significant shift in terms of terminology and priority in the language we use and the experiences we're trying to provide, right? We have shifted from a colorblind way of approaching things to like, identity does matter. It does shape our experiences. And we have found that kind of a race neutral approach to things really defaults to privilege for the groups for the people who are in more dominant groups. They end up having services that really lean towards their experience and center their norms. And for those that are not in privileged groups, that looks really different. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And so, I want us to be thinking today, one second, let me full screen that. We're going to talk about some of the evolving priorities, thinking about equitable and inclusive experiences and some of the considerations we have. So, I just like some questions for you to consider as we go through. Why does this data matter? How do experiences differ? And what can we do with this information? I'm going to touch on these 5 concepts. These are things that really do shape people's experiences within institutions. And, I imagine we're all entering in very different places in our knowledge in this space. Some of you may have done extensive equity, diversity, and inclusion work, and some of you may not have not. So I want to make sure we have this kind of baseline concepts for you all as you're having these discussions moving forward. So I want to start with just talking about terminology, because it's important for us to understand that terminology is always evolving, and recognize that when we start using a term, it's often in reaction to something, right? So we started using this term acknowledging a past reality, but then often if we don't solve the inequality underneath, the terms need to change because they aren't necessarily meeting people's experiences. So I want to start with ask you all to just think about your own experiences. Think about how many of you have heard someone say or said yourself, I don't see color, right? I certainly was raised with that as a value of that. Color blindness was something we should be praised for, right? And you have to understand the context of when color blindness started was post-civil rights movement, where everything was regimented by color. And what we were trying to say when we started saying, I don't see color, was I don't see you as inferior. I don't see you as less than because of your color. Now, the challenge of the way we started to apply this concept over time was that we started to pretend that we didn't actually notice difference, right? That I didn't see your color. And that is really problematic and confusing, right? I have 3 children. When you say to a kid, I don't see color, they're like, well, what do you see? Like, noticing difference is cognitively inevitable. Babies as early as 6 months are noticing racial differences in folks. Kids' brains are set to categorize. So we're constantly sorting and trying to make sense of color blindness, not seeing color. And so we want to recognize that when we talked about I don't see color and therefore I don't see you as inferior, we kind of focused on the wrong part of that equation for a while. People got really wrapped up in like, I don't even notice that we're different, rather than really the problem is assuming people are less than. That's where we need the intervention. So when we think about understanding what we're talking about with colorblind, right? It means that you're unable to distinguish colors. You're not. What we've come to mean by it is some of these other things. But the impact of that is that when we don't pay attention to color, when we're not color conscious, then we can't see problems related to race, right? It limits our ability to appreciate individualism and what a person's identity is, right? It can be very alienating to say to a person of color, I don't see color. That's equated to saying, I don't see you for who you are. I don't see your experiences for what they are. So, what has happened is that this color blindness has become a way to really not stay present to what racial disparities might be existing. So some of the challenges in not seeing color is that it's significant, scientifically impossible, but it invalidates people's identities. It invalidates their experiences with racism, right? That it takes off the table a critique about what racial harm might be existing in the space, and a critique of who might be benefiting and who might be harmed by certain policies. It narrows people's understanding of the world and can lead to disconnection, right? It limits, as a white person, it limits my understanding of what the world is if I'm not noticing how different races and identities experience the world. I equate it to like, imagine if we had a court case and only the prosecution was able to present their case, right? We would have a totally incomplete understanding of what happened. And that's colorblindness gives us kind of an incomplete look at things. It also, it suggests that it's something to be seen as negative. It sets up color as the problem, that I can appreciate you despite your race, but I have to kind of ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. It's certainly from when we're talking about this data, it doesn't allow us to track different experiences. It doesn't allow us to pay attention to where racial disparities and discrimination might be coming up. So, I work with schools a lot. If we don't pay attention to the racial disparities in discipline or in opportunity gaps, we are solving the wrong problems. So, I think for me, as someone who does this work strategically, I think the problem solving piece is really important, right? If we don't understand the context of why something happens, we may solve the wrong thing. So you may remember the Pulse nightclub massacre in Florida a few years ago. It was a LGBTQ plus bar, and it was mostly transgender and folks of color that were targeted. There was a lot of xenophobia, there was a lot of homophobia. But if we don't understand that context and we're just like, this is a problem of bar security, we need to beef up bar security at every bar, right? Without not focusing on the homophobia and the transphobia and the xenophobia, we're going to solve the wrong problem, right? So colorblindness ends up being a form of racism, in that it has more of a threat to racial justice, and that it, I personally believe if we can't talk about a problem, then we can't solve the problem, right? So, and then, this is just an example of, right, can we really look at these two women and say we don't notice their difference, right? Like that we don't see their race. So I'm gonna unshare for a second. I'd love to show this video. I don't know if you all are familiar with Francesca Ramsey. She is an excellent social commentator and breaks down a lot of different concepts. And so I thought she had a couple of good minutes here. So if whoever's running the tech can show that video, that would be great.
Have you ever wondered why people say, oh, I don't see color as a way to fix racism? Yeah, that doesn't work. On this show, we talk about race all the time, but I've got a bomb to drop. Biologically speaking, race doesn't exist. Oh my goodness, we've all been lied to! Wait, why am I hosting this show? So race isn't biological, but the social construct of race and racism still have a very real impact on everyone's lives. And this isn't just about feelings. Race is all about the structural foundation of social power. So why do so many people incorrectly think race is biological? Well, beyond the fact that we like to group people based on external characteristics, it goes like this. In biology, there is a concept of genetically different subspecies, which a lot of people confuse with human races. Biologists actually have a scale for this, and humans don't even come close to qualifying. Throughout history, people have used this incorrect understanding of subspecies to justify all kinds of terribleness, and even proclaim other races as less than human. But modern genetics has shown that the lines around race are so arbitrary that they're actually meaningless. And since I'm not a scientist, I'll take a quote. Francis Collins, the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, said it himself: "Those who wish to draw precise racial boundaries around certain groups will not be able to use science as a legitimate justification." Oops, I dropped the mic. So if race doesn't exist biologically, why do we keep talking about it? Sound the alarm! We keep talking about race because we created it. Yay, us! That's right, race is a social construct. A social construct is a category, perception, or idea created and developed by society and then applied to individuals or groups. But social constructs are still very real and have huge impacts on our lives. Because you know what else is a social construct? Money. And if you don't think money has an enormous impact on your life, well then congratulations. You either have a trust fund or you're an adorable baby. Or maybe you're a dog. Here's what I know. Talking about racism just creates more racism. No. First off, race isn't the problem. Racism is. And even if it was the problem, problems don't get worse when you talk about them, and they don't magically go away when you ignore them. Not true. I had 5 cavities, I ignored them, and all 5 of those teeth fell out. Poof! Problem solved. Colorblindness, while nice in theory, has no effect on structural and institutional racism. Racism is a system, and that system benefits certain people at the expense of others. Ignoring it just lets those problems persist. Don't believe me? Let's take a look at some examples where colorblindness doesn't work. Number 1, preschool punishment. Let's face a fact, preschool-aged children of every race are monsters. But according to the US Department of Education Office for Civil Rights report released in 2014, Black children make up 18% of preschoolers, but almost half of all suspensions. Half. And I don't think anybody believes all these preschool teachers are racist out to get little Black children, but the data shows that Black and Latino children often face steeper punishments than their white classmates for the same behavior. That's a problem. And simply believing we shouldn't see race or we shouldn't talk about race does nothing to solve this problem. Number 2, the name study. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research confirmed that people with ethnic sounding names, that's a whole nother episode, are less likely to get interviewed when they apply for jobs. Meanwhile, applicants with white sounding names actually get 33% more callbacks for interviews. It's the equivalent of having 8 years of additional experience. Shout out to all the white Taquans struggling to get job interviews. And it's not just Black and white. They've done similar studies around the world, and in Canada, people with white sounding names were 35% more likely to get callbacks than people with Indian or Chinese sounding names. So instead of just assuming people shouldn't care about color or names, companies, governments, and schools should take the bias out of hiring and experiment with nameless resumes to, solve the problem. Number 3, renting an apartment. When the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Urban Institute did a study about real estate, they found that Black, Latino, and Asian renters were shown up to 12% fewer units than white renters. And when the Fair Housing Justice Center used actors to apply for apartments, they found that Black and Latino renters were often told there were no apartments available, while white applicants were shown apartments in the same building. So this building has a pool, a laundry room, and a racist landlady. Colorblindness won't fix housing discrimination. We're going to need smart laws and a concerted effort for that. So tell me again how colorblindness is going to fix the fact that I can't get an education, a job, or a house. In many cases, colorblindness is actively harmful because it creates a false sense of security for the groups it directly benefits. The people who've benefited from systemic racism can assume that they got the job or a house or weren't suspended from preschool simply because they were more qualified or just better. Ignoring race or only acknowledging that it doesn't exist biologically is not a solution to these systemic issues. It takes work, effort, laws, and new systems to undo racism. These differences may seem minute, but they're part of a very large structure of oppression that's been ingrained in us. If we can understand that we made it up, we can actively work to change it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time right here on Decoded.
Okay, so, this is a bit of a simple clip and it uses humor. And I don't want to diminish that this is actually a pretty huge shift for many of us, that many of us have so embedded in our upbringing that colorblindness was something to be valued and something to strive for, that it'll show up in us often, right? And we can maybe go to 10 trainings where we talk about how colorblindness is not valued anymore, and we might still catch ourselves in moments where we're leaning towards ways of operating that promote colorblindness. So, I give yourself some room if you're struggling with this, or it feels new to you, because it really is a tremendous shift for some of us that were raised in the 80s, 90s, or were raising kids in the 80s, 90s like that. That was very much the thing that was seen as praiseworthy. Wait, I'm not trying to play that again. Nope. Hold on, there we go. Okay, so I want to talk about a couple of these other terms quickly. When we think about tolerance, many of us have also been, taught, that tolerance is something to be valued. And I just want us to think about that when we are functioning in a space where, hate crimes are common and people are targeted for their identity, then tolerance may seem like an accomplishment. It may seem like progress. But when we are really trying to think about how we, within libraries and organizations, truly serve all populations that we need to, tolerance is not enough, right? Think about this. I'm going to use Deborah since she's on my screen. Deborah, I've decided to tolerate you right? Isn't that like there's a power dynamic in that of me saying that I get to decide who's tolerable, and also like who wants to be tolerated. We want to be celebrated and affirmed and valued for who we are. Many of you may have been remember when like the multiculturalism and diversity bandwagon first swept through in the business that we call this heroes and holidays, right? We talk about Dr. Martin Luther King and we have this cultural food and we're diverse, right? These things of exposure are valuable, but we can't end there. I would say that we really don't want to be using the word diversity without also using the word inclusion. And frankly, I think you don't want to use either without also using equity. That, you know, diversity is about having different representation in a space, but that doesn't mean that people are having a positive experience in the space. And so sometimes we get stuck in the optics, right? How many of these people were at this thing? Oh, great, it was a success. You know, an example of where this kind of runs amok is there was a Black man who went to a predominantly white institution, had a terrible experience, left the institution, and he's still on the brochure 15 years later. That's an example of like diversity for diversity's sake, not about making sure that people's experiences are equitable in any way. So, you know, you may also have heard terms cultural competence. Being competent is better than being incompetent. You know, I think the challenge here is that sometimes we get a little overconfident, like, oh, I read some stuff or I went to training about these kind of people, so I know they like this kind of eye contact and this kind of body distance, and it doesn't create space for people to have their own personalities and preferences and multiple identities that shape their experience. So, you know, an example of cultural competence is my kids and I were at the St. Patrick's Day parade one year marching, and they wanted to do all the tattoos, and they said, Mom, we put some tattoos on. And I was about to, and I said, oh, wait, no, I'm speaking in a synagogue tomorrow. It didn't make me like a Judaic scholar. I can't quote the Torah, but I knew enough about the Holocaust and tattoos and the Jewish community to say that this could be something that was offensive. And so, you know, it can save you from embarrassment or harm or that kind of thing, but you shouldn't, you know, get overconfident of like, oh, I'm now an expert on what this group of people wants, right? We always want to be in consultation with the actual people about what is good for them. So we're moving, you know, we're talking a lot about equity. I think, you know, for many of us that are in this field, equity is at the forefront, you know, equity, diversity, inclusion. Inclusion is an easy thing to do poorly. And when we do it poorly, we reinforce the belief that it can't work. So we might, you know, this is an example of diversity. We have a child in a wheelchair in the class, but this is inclusion. He's in the striped sweater in the corner there, right? That he's actually feels a part of things and not separated. And this was maybe the right thing for this student. Maybe the next student really is identified with their wheelchair and they absolutely want to have it as part of the photo. So you can't say, oh, I had one of these type of students before, this is what they want, right? We need to make sure that we're in relationship to make sure that we're doing the right thing for each student. But as we move towards talking about equity is about everyone getting what they need to reach their fullest potential. I imagine many of you have seen this graphic. So I'll just go through it quickly. Equality is everybody gets the same thing, right? But they don't necessarily have the same outcome. Even with that same intervention of the box, some kids can't see the game, right? Equity is making sure that everybody gets the thing they need to have the same outcome, right? So if my child doesn't need a math tutor, another child getting a math tutor isn't something that's like being done to my child. It's just that kid needs a math tutor to have the same outcomes that my child has without a math tutor. The challenge with this equity graphic is that it still sort of puts the burden on the people or the groups. And I think what's most important to recognize in this equity graphic is that the problem is not the children, the problem is the fence. And that's what we're talking about today with this database system, is that the fences, the systems that we create that either allow people to fully get to experience something and see the game, or we create obstacles for that they either individually have to find ways around or as a group find ways around. And so, you know, a big part of our role is, what are the fences we can eliminate? What are the ways that we can take away those barriers? And this is an ever evolving concept. You might have seen this one where, you know, the third graphic is liberation, and that fourth square is your idea here, because it's, you know, continuing to change. I also want to note that, you know, even this graphic suggests that everybody's starting in the same place. And if it was really accurate about people's experiences, it would probably be a slope. And some people would be stories down trying to overcome different barriers that have existed for them to get to the same place where other people were even starting. So, you know, these are some of the concepts that we are to talk about. You know, always moving towards cultural humility, owning what we don't know, and giving people space to tell their stories. I think that's why we've landed on this combination of questions for the database of not just boxes that we provide that you select, but also maybe having some self-selection, because we, the way we may see other people's identity is often incomplete or limited, and so giving folks space to be able to tell us about themselves. So diversity is a fact, equity is a choice, inclusion is an action, and belongingness is an outcome. And I think when we're talking about this data, we're talking about, wonky data stuff, but it's really about belongingness. We're trying to create space. EPL is trying to create space where everyone feels like they belong. And so then all of these pieces become part of that strategy to make sure that anybody of any identity believes that library is their place, right? It feels like that's a place where they belong. All right. So I think it's also important for us to talk about bias and where that shows up. And so I want to do a couple of definitions just to get us started here. And I think when we're talking about this, and particularly as we're talking about demographic data, there's often confusion between race, ethnicity, and nationality in both how the documents are set up and how people themselves identify, because we often use these all as synonyms when we mean something different by them. And the video tells us that race isn't scientifically significant, and yet it has a whole lot of social import because of it being a social construct. And so us thinking about how do we make sure we have space for this, I think also having space for people to talk about language is a key part of making sure we're serving folks, because again, we could be solving the wrong problem. We're putting together this great program targeted at this population, but it's not in the language that they can receive it in. So, when we think about prejudice, I think it's important for us to recognize this is something all people are capable of. It's about thoughts and assumptions and beliefs and stereotypes. It's not the action-based piece yet, it's more internal. And one of the ways that this shows up is with bias, right? So I have found that the best way to notice bias in myself is to pay attention to surprise. When somebody tells me something about themselves and I'm surprised, it means I was filling in some kind of narrative about them that isn't true, right? I thought their family looked this way, or I thought they had these kind of experiences. And then they tell me the truth about their lives and I'm surprised, means that, there was some assumptions that I had. And the reality is that for every time I'm surprised, there's probably hundreds of times where I'm not surprised, not because my assumptions were correct. I'm just not in relationship with that person to find out that I was wrong. So you can't see much of me here, but I when people look at me, lots of words come to mind. Triathlete is probably not one of them. But I had 3 kids under 2. So I did everything I could to run away from them. I did a triathlon, I did a half marathon. I ran every block of every street in Evanston when I turned 40. But people may see my body type and assume that I'm unathletic or lazy. I play tennis 4 days a week. I play on a softball team. But again, people might see my body and say, oh, that person is this. And so, bias, we have this opportunity to really notice that in ourselves, right? Not to say oh, I don't have a bias bone in my body, because all of us have bias, but to really pay attention to where does that come from? What does that mean? When we talk about bias kind of institutionally or in a professional setting, we often think about it as an exclusion of a group, and it can be, right? It can be a way to keep people out. But often bias actually probably has more impact by those that we gravitate towards, right? If I say, I played a sport in college, and then one of you played a sport in college, we might have a connection that we then have a conversation. Or I say I was in a sorority, or I taught at DePaul, whatever those things are. And that leads to some transactional things, of us being willing to kind of help each other out, or think highly of, or include someone that we feel like in some way. And so what happens is it's both the inclusion of folks that we feel are like us and the exclusion of folks that we feel that aren't, that compound the way that bias plays out. So I would love to do a little exercise if we can. If everybody can take out a piece of paper and a pen, or you can type on your computer on a different screen if that's easier for you. And I'm going to read a paragraph, and then I'd like you to just write down your first response. I'm going to read a paragraph, and I'm going to ask a series of questions, and you're just going to write down your response to the questions. There's no right or wrong answers. It's whatever you imagine. Okay. All right. So 3 youth are driving in a car. And when they reach the intersection and see the stop sign, they don't fully stop, they roll through the intersection. 2 police officers see the rolling stop and pursue the car with their lights and siren on. The music in the car with the youth is so loud that the police officers pull up next to the car and signal that the car should pull over. The car does pull over, and the police get out of their squad car and ask all the youth to get out of the car. The police officers search the car and find some drugs in the trunk. Okay, first question. What time of day does this story take place? Whatever you imagine. Second question, is it in an urban, rural, or suburban setting? What was the race of the youth? What was the gender of the youth? What was the race of the police officers? What was the gender of the police officers? What kind of car were the youth driving? What kind of music was playing on the radio? What kind of drugs were found in the car? Did anybody involved have a noticeable physical disability? Did anybody involved have an invisible disability? Take a second to write down any other details that you saw in your mind. All right, I'm going to go through this a little quickly so we won't have a chance to hear everybody's answers as much as possible. If you can raise your hand for me, that's probably our best visual to go through. How many of you thought it happened like during the school day, 9 to 3 during the day? Raise your hand if that was you, okay? What about 3 to 6 in the afternoon? 6 to 9 at night? Okay, 9 to midnight. And then in the middle of the night. Okay, we all imagine something different, right? How many of you had imagined a urban environment? Okay, how many a suburban environment? How many a rural environment? Okay, so can you imagine if I had just given you a location, how that might have changed your answers? If I said this happened in Lincoln Park, if I said this happened in Inglewood, if I said this happened in Champaign-Urbana, right? All of it might have shifted, okay? What we're doing here is looking at bias, right? I did not give you any of these details. We all filled in a story based on the information I gave. And it's important for us to recognize that our biases are connected, right? So once we make one assumption, it leads to a bunch of other assumptions, right? So it can just keep compounding. And you know, and location is a big one of what we might assume. How many of you had all kids of color in the car? How many of you had all white kids? How many of you had had a combination of white kids and kids of color? Okay, so again, once we made a location assumption, that might make an assumption of what the racial makeup of the group is. How many of you had all boys in the car? Yeah, I've never had anybody say it was a bunch of girls rocking out to Taylor Swift, right? It is often assumed that it's boys. Now there's 3 things that shape our assumptions in this. Number one, you heard the story and you thought these kids are kind of trouble, right? Then you might imagine a certain group. The second is you hear the story and you think these cops are kind of overstepping, right? That might shape what you think, right? Particularly with all the things in the news, like you might say like it must have been kids of color because I don't think white kids would have had their car searched, right? Whatever our experiences and lenses might be. The third thing that can shape your answers is I was in this car. I totally had this happen to me and my group of friends. And so I'm imagining exactly the people who were in the car, okay? So our own lived experiences can shape our bias as well. All right, so how many of you had all white police officers and all male police officers? Yeah, I think that's common for us in how we view authority, and we're taught to view authority, right? So that is pretty common. What about what kind of car were they driving? How many of you had like a fancy car, like an Escalade or a Mercedes, right? So if you're in that situation, you might have thought of the kids as suburban or urban and drug dealers, right? If you had like some of you had a middle of the road, like a Honda Civic, right? And some of you might have had like a dilapidated car, like a beater, right? And then that probably, so Also, like location leads to assumptions about race, makes assumptions about class, right? That takes us down a road. Anybody have the music was hip hop or rap? Right, so that could be either, because white kids have totally appropriated hip hop or rap, so it could be either in the car. Anybody have rock? Right, that might be more white kids. Like probably nobody had like Vivaldi or some kind of concerto. And then what kind of drugs? How many people had marijuana? It's an equal opportunity drug, right? A lot of us might have had that. Anybody have cocaine? You may have had white people in the car. Crack, you might have had people of color in the car. Meth, you probably had white people, right? So this is the best way I can show folks on how to notice bias in ourselves, because it's a pretty simple paragraph, yet we all are able to imagine what this looks like. I think it's also important for us to recognize most of us do not imagine anybody with a physical disability in the car. We're not thinking of kids being included in that way and being able to participate. Generally, if it's an invisible disability, it's an emotional or behavioral issue, and therefore you've kind of cued that the kids were trouble, and therefore you're assuming that they have regulation challenges or other things. So I think, pay attention to this. It's important for us to recognize there's automatic thought and there's reflective thought. And there's a lot of research that suggests that because we are inundated with so many racist messages in our society, our automatic thought is pretty problematic across the board, right? That even folks in the groups, right? They had a gay activist do a set of questions about gay people and they picked all negative words, right? Because we're inundated with these messages. So there are interventions we can do on the automatic thought, but really the focus is on the reflective thought. I thought this thing, but why? I don't actually, right? I saw a black man and I started to cross the street, and then I had to sit with like, wait a minute, I don't actually think that person is a threat. Like what is going on for me? That's a big part of what we want to do with bias, is to start breaking down some of those things. Okay, so I'm going to skip some of these definitions. I do want to talk about power, because I think this is important in our conversation, what we're doing with this database. Power is the ability to define reality and convince other people that it's their definition. Right? I get to set all the norms and terms in a place and then convince you that they're the right norms and terms, even if they're not working for you. It's also about resources and influence, but it's often about setting the terms. And in different spaces, we have different power. In this case, we have the power to create space for people to identify themselves and to tell us who they are, so that that can lead to us being more effective in serving a diverse population, right? We can then figure out how to use that data to better provide programs and services and resources and access in a way that we might not now. Privilege is really thinking about this as a lack. It's a lack of challenges, which is really hard to wrap your mind around, a lack of something. It's very common for us to universalize our experiences like this is how everybody experiences something, until we are confronted with someone experiencing it a different way, right? Nobody ever checks my ID at Target. So if I don't see anyone else's ID getting checked, I might assume nobody's ID ever gets checked at Target, right? Because mine doesn't. I'm just trusted and given the benefit of the doubt that my credit card is my credit card, right? So I think it's important to talk about all the different ways that privilege manifests in our culture. Here's some of the categories of privilege. It's not all of them. And I think I like to kind of give it as see it in a person, right? So I will use myself as an example. I'm white, I'm a US citizen, I'm able-bodied, I'm upper middle class, I have a graduate degree, I was raised in a two-parent heterosexual household, I worked in higher education for over 15 years, and I am the biological parent. I carried our oldest child, my wife carried our twins. And so then the places where I don't have privilege, I'm a woman, I'm gay, my gender expression is not particularly feminine, I'm in a same-sex marriage, although we just call it a marriage, I don't gay park my car or anything like that. And I'm also the non-biological parent. So as I said, when my wife carried the twins, and people ask me, when the kids were little, would ask me all the time how my twin pregnancy was. And I'm like, it was great. I recommend a spare uterus if you get it. But it's important for us to see how these things work together, right? So if I'm thinking about my LGBT identity, I might be thinking about, I've lost family members because of it. I might be harassed in bathrooms and misgendered. The financial implications. So my wife and I had our family before the laws changed, so we spent probably $30,000 on adopting our own biological children and getting our name changed and all of those things. As a woman, I was a counselor for a long time around sexual violence, and so I've seen a lot of people harmed by misogyny and rape culture. And there's ways that unwanted attention and body shaming and all of those things, often seen as too loud or too outspoken. I taught for a long time adult students coming back to get their bachelor's degree. My father-in-law also taught in the program. He swore a lot in class. I swore a lot in class. I was the only one who ever heard from the dean about it, right? Like the gender difference and the assumption about that. So as I said, as a biological parent, that gave me access to the preschool mommy set, right? That I was able to talk about my C-section and breastfeeding and all these things that gave me a way to be included in conversations that were happening that maybe if I was just a non-biological parent, my being gay or my being more masculine might have been bigger issues. So it's important to see these as different things because of that, like, because I was the same socioeconomic class and education and I was white, I was able to navigate an environment where my other identities might have been a bigger issue. I can't just turn to another person who's LGBT and say, this is a good place for you, because maybe someone with a different socioeconomic background or different race or different educational level might not have that access and comfort. So while I might spend a lot of time thinking about the ways I lack privilege and how that shapes my life, if I don't also pay attention to the fact that I am white and what access that gives me and my socioeconomic class gives me, like, I'm missing the whole picture. My family's big into the national parks. We've been to like 22 already. We're going to 5 more in August. And we always run into somebody from our preschool at one of these parks across the country. And at first I was like, what a coincidence. And I'm like, no, we're all like the same socioeconomic class, same educational level. Like, yeah, that is why we're doing the same vacations, because we have the same means to do so. So it's important for us to be able to hold on to kind of what are those barriers that other people might be having. And recognize that, like, some of these things, like, really, like, if I am paying attention to how gender and sexual identity affect my life and not race, I am missing a significant part of the story. So I think, when we're thinking about who has access to our libraries, who feels comfortable in our libraries, who feels like they belong, we have to be thinking about privilege. Like, who is normed and centered and valued in this space? Is 85% of our collections one that looking like this, and then we have this little section for this group or for this group or for this group, right? Like, what is that saying about whose stories are valued in our space? So I love this graphic. It reminds me, when we think about privilege, if I asked you to walk down this hall and you went through 9 open doors, most of you would have a hard time remembering exactly how many open doors you went through, right? Because we don't notice a lack of obstacles. But if you went down that hall and 2 of the doors were locked and 5 were closed, and you would be really aware of all of the challenges that you had to go get somebody with a key. But because we universalize our experiences, the experience, when a friend who has a different identity comes to us and says, those doors were shut for me, our first response might be, what are you talking about? You just walked down the hall. What'd you do? You must have done something wrong, because when I went down the hall, I just went down the hall, right? And it's important to recognize that it's not one singular truth where everybody's having the same experience. So thinking, as you move forward, think about, like, what privileges do you carry, where do you lack privilege, and how that shapes your experience, I think, is really valuable. All right. I'm recognizing our time, and I want to make sure I have time for questions. So I'm going to skip over a couple of definitions. The one thing I would say is that comes up often. So internalized oppression is this concept that, like, for those of us that are in marginalized groups, we are raised in a culture that has a lot of negative messages about our groups. And so we often internalize those messages, and our identities are shaped with that in mind, right? I might, I will say, if you've ever heard a woman say, I'm not one of those catty women, right? That is where the message about women being catty is. Then I want to separate myself from that stereotype of our group, right? And many of us that are in groups that lack privilege have internalized some of these things. But I think it's also important to recognize that those of us who are in dominant groups have internalized that dominance, right? And so it might be difficult for us to understand why we need this data or why we need to create the space, because everyone can just, like, the libraries are just open, they're public entities. Why do we need to make this a thing? But internalized dominance has us feeling like everything's our space, right? Like, that it's feeling like this is our place. And so we don't notice, what obstacles other people are experiencing. I like the idea of the horse with blinders on. We see very clearly, we just have no idea what's over here and no idea what's over here. And so when we think about prejudice or discrimination, we often think about this outer circle of, like, fear and disgust. But I want you to look at that first circle. It starts with a lack of interest. A lack of interest in knowing other people's traditions, and a lack of interest in knowing what obstacles exist for them in a space. Then it can lead to discomfort and resentment and stuff, but it starts with just not being that interested about how this is happening for other people. And similarly with discrimination, yes, it can get to exclusion and violence, but it starts with segregation, right? We're just not proximate to folks that are experiencing things in a different way. We are not in a relationship with them to know the way they are experiencing things. And I think that can shape what we think are the problems that need to be solved within our institutions. And so it's really important for us to get that information from folks, to get that people are experiencing it in a different way. And that the way to get to that equitable experience is to start by the demographic information, getting that, hey, maybe everybody in this space is not the same. Okay, now we can learn more about how their experiences are not the same. All right. Intersectionality is also important, that none of us are just one identity. So I like this graphic. This is my friend Bob. He's a stripy triangle. There's places he can go because he's stripy, and there's places he can go where he can be a triangle, but nowhere he can be a stripy triangle. So it is incredibly important that as we set up things to try to eliminate barriers, that we're not doing it based on one singular identity and asking people to choose, oh, is gender more important? Is race more important? Is sexual identity more important? People need to be able to be all the things that they are. All right, I want to show another clip. I'm gonna stop sharing screen for a second. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to show this clip. I'm going to tell you where you can find it, because I know I want to have more time for questions. But essentially, when we talk about microaggressions, these are the everyday slights that people experience. It's the, can I touch your hair? And my hand's already in it. It was when my kids were little, I got asked the paternity of my kids every single time I was at the park, and I'd be like, and your name is? Like, we're not there in our relationship for this conversation. And it's a major obstacle to inclusion. When I worked at Northwestern, the medical school, our Black male medical students got asked for ID every single time they went into the library when no one else did. And it was a constant reminder that we don't see you as belonging here. You have to prove it in a way that no one else does, right? So it's those system pieces. But it's these everyday things. They're not intended to be harmful, but the impact is really significant. And this clip, you can find it on Hatch Workshop. It's a 3-minute clip of young people talking about their experiences with microaggressions. The key takeaway for me is that they talk about that they have experienced 291 microaggressions in a 90-day period. So this is not something that happens randomly once or twice. It is something that happens over and over and over again. And if we don't understand that, then we often respond to the behavior that comes after that, right? So you're in a library security context, we've questioned someone in some way, and they react volatilely because they're just like, I cannot believe I'm having to prove myself again. And then we get security involved, or we do something to police that reaction to the microaggression. So we don't understand that the microaggression is happening, right? If a kid throws a chair at school and we don't understand that on the playground, everybody was saying all these things about their identity, then we're just punishing them for the behavior without understanding what was leading to that behavior. And so imagine, for those of you who've been in a long-term relationship, imagine, most of us have the same 1 or 2 fights. Like, we've even just numbered them in our house. Like, oh, we're doing 2, cool. Because we've been together for 22 years. But, imagine the first time you had that fight, the 5th time you have that fight, the 12th time you have that fight, the 47th time you have that fight, is your response just a little bit elevated? It's not quite commensurate with what's happening, because you're in that moment, like, I cannot believe we are talking about this again, right? And that's what happens with microaggressions. It's that just repeated threat to belongingness. It's that repeated reminder that I don't see you as the same. And so, I think it's important for all of us to think about the microaggressions we've experienced, and pay attention to kind of what ones we do experience, what ones we don't experience. If this list is really short, you probably have a lot of areas of privilege, right? And be thinking about how we create space around that. All right. I love this slide. It's like the easiest, cheapest little graphic, but imagine we're all sitting around a table looking at the same thing, okay? But in reality, based on where we're sitting, some of us are seeing an E, some of us are seeing a 3, some of us are seeing a W, some of us are seeing an M, but we'll battle. How can you possibly say that's an M? It's so clearly a W, right? And we will try to get to one singular truth, rather than like, this library can be an amazing place for me and my family can love every minute of being inside, and another family can feel like this is not a great place, right? And how do we hold on to both of those things at the same time? All right. So I want us to think about, in terms of the library space, what does this mean for how people access and feel like they belong? What does it mean for what kind of collections we have and what we think people want to read and what they need? Is our offerings reflective of the various populations? Does everyone see themselves represented here? I think that certainly becomes a thing about fees and security and other kind of touch points that either create a place of belongingness or threaten that belongingness as we're there. So, you know, when we think about the work that we're doing, and I think this is where the data we're collecting is critical, is, you know, thinking about when we break down the EDI, what are we doing that is about the D? What are we doing that's about the I? And what are we doing about the E? And then how can all of that impact belongingness, right? If all of our interventions are in the D space, we probably have some work to do, right? Because it may not necessarily be reflective of how people, you know, are experiencing things overall. So I have a few more things I can go over, but I think it's probably helpful to pause and give people a chance for questions, and see if there's concepts we need to dig in further. I can stop the share for now. Questions, thoughts? Right, so when we talk about this concept, you know, and why the data matters, is that if we are not paying attention to who's using our space, then we don't have the means to determine whether there are these challenges to equitable experience, and that we need to think about how we construct our space and what the access challenges might be and all that. Like we can't solve the later problems if we don't have the data to start with who's here, right? And are the things that we are doing, you know, covering the needs of the people who are here. And then also the question is, like, if the data of who is here does not match who is in the area, then we have a lot of questions we need to ask ourselves, right? If, you know, 95% of the people who are coming to the library are white, but the population that we serve is not, that tells us something. And so, you know, and if even if people are trepidatious to fill out this form, and you're only the people who are white are giving you the data that you need, that also tells you something, that information feels high threat in your community. And so what are the things that we can do that create safety and create welcoming, so that those things don't feel unsafe, to be honest about?
That's my question, if I may. Like, you know, I can, I'm just thinking, the library I'm in is, there's a very diverse population, but it's overrepresented by the white population of that particular suburb. And I'm just kind of playing through this, you know, asking this information to the community, since most of the people that use the library are white, even though there are other people in the community, they just don't use the library as much, that the data is going to get skewed. You know, so this is, I'm like, all right, well, how do you get how can you get everybody in the community? Of course, in the library, we're all trying to do that anyway, but everybody in the community to know that there's this initiative, and would you please, you know, if you want, fill out this field.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things there. So the first is that it's really important to recognize that for folks that are in dominant groups, these kind of questions are not harmful. Right, so they're for those of us that are in marginalized groups, we're looking for language that says UCS, right? We're looking for language on websites, we're looking for language on forums, and that is part of building a space that we do want to come to, right? So often, you know, so if we think about like gender categories, right? Having something besides male or female as choices in gender categories, most people who identify as cisgender are like, why are you asking? Why is there not the third category? Why is there an other box? I don't get it. But for the people who need that category, that is huge, right? It is saying, I see you and I'm giving you a chance to identify yourself in this space. So even if nobody's using it yet, it being there matters, right? The second piece to that is like, if all of your data is white, right? That is telling you something about who you're serving, right? It's telling you about what outreach initiatives you might need to have, like what kind of, you know, what staffing changes you might need to have in terms of being more reflective of the community. Like it's not a useless piece of data. It's actually a really important piece of data for us to say, okay, like if this isn't what our community is, then that's a different set of work that we have to do. You know, the other thing to recognize when we're trying to do this work is that for many communities, trust is broken, either by your institution with the people who are there or by people long before you. And so the expectation can't be, well, we did this thing and people didn't use it, so forget it, right? That it is like, we're working from a deficit place of that trust has been broken. And so these are the things we're going to do to build trust, regardless if that becomes transactional right away or not, right? That these are, you know, this is like saying when I work with schools, well, we offered this, you know, this PTA session at a different time so that working parents could come, and then nobody came. So we're never going to do it again. And you're like, if it hasn't, if people's experiences haven't been centered in this space for decades, one effort is not going to radically change their trust in the system or their willingness to participate in the system. It's going to take an ongoing commitment. And I think that's an important thing to recognize with EDI is like, we don't know exactly how this data is going to play out, but it is important to stay for the long game with it. That by changing it repeatedly, you never get to know what rewards you can get from it. It's going to need to exist for a while, and people are going to need to be skeptical, and people are going to need to not exactly know whether they're comfortable getting all that information. But then maybe when they talk to their family member or friend, they say, yeah, the library asked me this stuff. I wonder what that's about, right? And then that gives us a chance to tell people why we're asking, and what, there's just, it leads to more and more opportunities. So, I think you can anticipate in some spaces, it will feel like the data is useless for a while. That probably is right. That it will not be representative of what it should be, but that is still really telling. And there's lots that can be done with that information as well.
Hey, Biz.
Hi, Kate.
How's it going?
It's great to see you.
You too. So my question is something that had come up when we originally talked about this at database management, which you spoke of a little bit about the race, ethnicity, nationality, and kind of how, when we're capturing data, how we capture that data matters, right? And so, and I know we're going to talk about this in the future, but I think that was a piece of it of, if we just have this one field, are we actually, and we're trying to cram things together, that was one of my concerns, is that going to actually be effective? Because like, for instance, in Northbrook, we have a very large Korean language population, but we also have a large Russian immigrant population. So they're not going to come up when you're just looking at race, but they absolutely will come up when you're talking about immigrant status, nationality. So how are we capturing that, and how do we go about gathering the data in a meaningful way and explaining to people how we're gathering that data? Because I think it's also being able to convey this to people without doing like a big presentation is going to be so critical.
Yeah, and there's a couple different levels to that, Kate. So so first of all, I want to start with like, and this is something that Deborah and I have talked a lot about, like, there is not a consensus of like, this is the list. These are the questions that everybody should ask exactly in this way. I talked to a good friend of mine who's like a big researcher in this space, and she's like, nope, there is no, this is the right and only way to go. So that is both pros and cons, right? We do have some ability to create what we need, but it also means that from a comparability standpoint, sometimes the way we collect it won't interface the way we want with other systems. I think it is important for me to, acknowledge that like the setup is not ideal, right? If you ask me what technology I wanted to have, like what capabilities, it's not what we have currently. Like I would want to be able to choose more than one in the question. I would want to have a language question. I would want, there's more. I think that this is a start, right? And I think there's value in starting and seeing what gaps exist or what isn't working, and then build from there. I think you should anticipate as a board that like, we probably need to revisit this conversation down the line, right? We probably need to say, okay, this is what we found with the questions, the way we framed them. Here's what we now think is missing from that. Let's add this field, or let's change the functionality in some way. But based on the premise we were given to solve was like, here's the question the space you have. We're trying to figure out the best way with the limitations of the software to do it. But I do think that there's maybe a long term that looks different than what is now. I think as far as the understanding, as I said, I think there's a couple different levels to that, right? I do think that there's going to need to be some kind of talking point toolkit type thing for staff that is conducting this, right? So that they understand what they're doing and why they're doing. I think there's probably going to need to be a couple sentence inserts that person reads before they start and in between, this question to this question, just to help people understand, like, yeah, when you start, not only is it the lack of trust piece, but it's also what are you using it for, right? Before marriage equality happened, if you asked me whether I was single or married, I had to ask, what is this form for? Because if you're asking like, because you want to know my story, I'm married. But if you're asking for like legal reasons, I was single by the government, right? So there is this just like, people who have been harmed by forms will need to know a little bit of like, what are you trying to do with this, both to answer accurately and also to feel seen. So I think there's some things that we can do that both help the staff create the right space for it. And I think there's some stuff we can do in short messages to the people who are receiving it and say like, this is what this is about, right? Like particularly if you're talking to someone who's undocumented and you start asking these questions, right? They need to know that this is not to collect information about them to target them in any way, right? That this is about, we want to make sure you're getting what you need in this space. And so any information you're willing to provide is great, right? So, you know, I think it's just recognizing like where there's been harm by other institutions and how that might affect the data that we're compiling, right? So we might find that like we get a ton of prefers not to say, right? And then we have to think about, okay, like, is that anything we can do on our end in terms of the user experience with the staff they're talking to, or is that something that like we're just going to keep having this there and trust will build over time, that this is, you know, that this has not been used for nefarious reasons, right? Because the community will talk, right? So if someone fills it out and then, you know, a year, 6 months later, a year later, like nothing harmful has happened to them, they'll be like, no, it's cool. It didn't turn into anything, right? So, you know, that example of like undocumented, like there might be a Latinx person that is documented and someone is undocumented, and they might talk to each other about like, no, this is why it was okay. This is what they were trying to do with it. So, you know, I think that because you're operating in such a system where so many different people are going to use this different ways, I think a strong centralized like toolkit talking point things is really useful to provide folks to say like, here's what the intent is, here's what the potential impact is, here's some recommendations on how to use it. Here's a phone a friend number of like, if you have more questions. And then, but knowing that like the way, you know, a library in a more rural community is going to use it is going to be different than the way EPL is going to use it, right? In terms of like, but the staff understanding is a big part of that. If I as a staff member don't know why we're doing this and I think it's dumb, then the way I ask those questions can cause harm, right? It can be perceived as, I think your identities are not important, right? So we do want to make sure we are having conversation with folks to say like, here's what we're trying to do with this.
Thanks. That was great. It always spawns more questions than answers, right?
Yes, you're on the right track if you don't know all the things you need to know in this moment, right? Like if you
Well,
feel super confident that you've got it all figured out, you're probably missing some serious things.
I almost never feel like I have it all figured out, so that must mean I'm on the right track.
Any other questions I can answer for folks? So I hope, you know, I hope we can continue to have conversations, and Deborah will have great information about like the specifics and the logistics, but I think it's helpful for us to understand kind of the why and the intent and the impact. And, you know, the basic premise is just that not everybody has the same experience, and we want everyone to have the best experience they can have. So this information helps us provide that and helps us as a larger network, but also as individual institutions customize what our offerings are to the folks that we're trying to serve. And I do think, you know, to your point earlier, like it is an important data point. If all of our users, all the people willing to fill this out are all from dominant groups, that does tell us something about either who's not using our space or who doesn't feel safe enough in our space to share their truth. All right. Or is there anything else I can answer?
I don't think so. Thank you, Biz. I know you gave me a lot to think about. I'm sure the rest of the directors as well. So this was really, really important and meaningful. And like I said, a lot of food for thought. So thank you for taking the time to educate us a little bit.
I'm happy to be here. This is the work I do with individual libraries, with Rails, with schools. You know, I think it's this stuff does not happen accidentally. It takes time, it takes intentionality, and it takes mistakes. It takes learning from, okay, we thought this was going to be the thing that was going to make the difference, and that did not at all. So let's go back to the drawing board. So if there's additional questions I can answer for you or support you in your other spaces in any ways, just reach out.
Thank you, Biz.
All right. Thanks all. Take care.
Thank you. Okay, as I said earlier, and as Deborah has said, we're not deciding anything today. We're not asking you to decide anything today, but we thought that was an important for all of us to hear. I think for most of us, for me, I think it really helped me understand why Evanston may want to move forward with this, and you know, something that the rest of us may consider for our libraries, and why we may or may not want to do that. So I think we left off the update on ILS settings. Deborah, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. As you know, COVID has been happening for quite some time now. So last year, CCS and Governing Board, this group worked together to approve some ILS changes in response to what was happening with COVID. With the move now to phase 5 of the Restore Illinois plan, the bulk of ILS settings have now been reverted back to normal. So I just wanted to give this group a quick update on where we are with some of those. By next week, all CCS libraries will be participating in intra-CCS lending, so sharing of materials back and forth. Libraries have had various renovation projects, so there has been some delays in some libraries getting back to intra-CCS lending, but we're back in business with all 28 members by the end of this week. All libraries have resumed Pickup Anywhere for CCS patrons. So if you remember, we suspended our Pickup Anywhere policy last year due to changes in pickup options due to COVID. So some libraries opted for a period of time to only allow holds pickup to their own patrons while we were doing curbside and managing the chaos of that. But as of the end of this week, all libraries will again be offering holds pickup to CCS patrons. As is our normal policy, each library can individually determine whether Chicago Public and reciprocal card holders that are not from CCS libraries can pick up holds. So that still stands. We have reverted all of our settings post-April Governing Board related to quarantine. So if you remember, in April, we voted to require libraries to stop quarantining materials. Those settings have all been adjusted since the last meeting. And then we have begun allowing share libraries to place holds directly in PowerPack for interlibrary loan. So there may be some small settings that might have been adjusted for libraries individually due to COVID. If there is something your library needs to change back to a pre-COVID standard, you can just open a help desk ticket. But I think we're kind of back in business with the bulk of our major ILS settings that were changed last year. So that's a good feeling. It feels good. Any questions? All right, yeah, back to you.
So moving on to reports, as president, I don't really have anything since it's my first meeting, though I will say that if you have ever been to Morton Grove and seen our youth services department, it was awful. My staff is wonderful, but my space is awful, but we're almost done with the renovation. And so hopefully soon you guys can all come out and see that. That's a little personal library information. The one thing that we did want to address a little bit is a lot of questions have been come up about what's happening at Niles Main District Library, and Cindy is here from there. So Cindy, if you want to give us just a brief update of how things are going and what we can do to help you guys out.
Hello. Let's see. How are things going? We are in an interim period, obviously. The business manager and myself as co-assistant directors are carrying on. There's been no decision by the board at this point with regard to that. We do have our public hearing next week on the budget and appropriations, tentative budget and appropriations. And so that meeting is scheduled for the 21st to adopt the budget for next year. As far as internally, things are continuing on. Summer reading is going very well. We are going to be participating in the open houses at the schools this year, and programming has been turned in for the fall. So I don't know if you have particular questions. You know, the reality is the library is serving our patrons, and as I was listening to this presentation, which was very helpful, and Biz has been at our library and done an in-service for us. So it was a nice refresher, but it's like to remember that, you know, we're going to welcome all of these people into the library next week for a public hearing. And, you know, how often do we wish hundreds of people would come to the library, right? So it's like, okay, this is going to be great. You know, these people are coming to the library and this is what we want. So I'm just looking forward to welcoming lots of people. Any questions I can answer for you or?
So just to clarify, Cindy, are you guys open just the 54 hours still? Is that correct?
No, we are still at 66.
66, okay.
So we were at 54 during the bridge. And so when the governor went to phase 5, then we added 12 hours, opening up at 9, which added 6 hours because we were opening at 10. So we opened at 9. Staff was already in the building at 9, but we weren't open to the public. So we opened up at 9, and then we added 3 evenings. From 7, we were opening, closing at 7, and now we're closing at 9 on those 3 evenings. So 6 hours in the evening and 6 hours that first hour in the morning, or the 12 hours that were added to get to 66.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Well, like I said, I think, you know, anything we can do to help out, certainly we're all here willing to do that. And so fingers crossed that things go smoothly.
Thank you.
Going forward. So, okay, do secretary report? Anything?
No report.
No report. Treasurer, Mick, do you have anything?
Report.
Deborah, do you have anything else as executive director, acting executive director?
No, unless anyone has any questions on anything in the packet.
Any questions for Deborah? No. Committees and groups. Anything? No?
No updates beyond the agenda items.
Great. Okay. Well, I think that's it. We've been a little long today because of business presentation, but we're still ending before noon. So thank you, everyone. I will officially adjourn the meeting at 11:41 a.m.
Thank you all.
Everyone, thank you.